Hey guys. Settle here. Tonight, we're easing into something softer, and far more judgmental. Not wars. Not emperors. Not gladiators. Tonight we're talking about pressure. The quiet, daily, exhausting pressure of looking correct in ancient Rome. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending your evenings being calmly judged by long-dead civilizations. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady background hum. And let's drift gently into a world where your eyebrows had political consequences. In ancient Rome, beauty was not decoration. It was documentation. Your face was not a canvas. It was evidence. Evidence that you were disciplined. Evidence that you were respectable. Evidence that you understood your place in a society that believed moderation was the highest virtue, and also the hardest to achieve. Rome did not believe appearance was accidental. If you looked balanced, composed, orderly, Rome assumed your soul matched. If you looked disheveled, excessive, dramatic, or careless, Rome assumed the opposite. There was no neutral face. There was only a public statement. And that statement followed you everywhere. The marketplace. The bathhouse. The dinner party. The Senate. The temple. Your body walked into the room before you spoke. And it spoke loudly. Roman philosophy adored balance. Too much emotion. Suspicious. Too little emotion. Cold. Too much grooming. Vain. Too little grooming. Negligent. Too muscular. Laborer. Too soft. Weak. Too pale. Possibly unhealthy. Too tan. Definitely working class. The ideal Roman body existed in a narrow, invisible lane called respectable moderation. And staying inside that lane required constant correction. This is where the anxiety began. Because moderation sounds peaceful. Until you realize no one tells you exactly where the line is. You simply learn when you've crossed it. Usually through gossip. Roman society operated on observation. People watched. Neighbors watched. Servants watched. Friends watched. Strangers watched. You were assessed before you were addressed. A woman entering a gathering was measured silently. Is her skin pale enough? Is her makeup too heavy? Is her hair elaborate but not absurd? Is she youthful but not trying too hard? Is she aging gracefully but not too comfortably? A man was evaluated just as quickly. Is he groomed but not polished? Clean but not scented? Strong but not excessive? Serious but not grim? Confident but not theatrical? And none of these standards were written in stone. They were simply known. Which made them more powerful. Because you could never argue against something that was just obvious. Roman beauty was tied to morality. This is what made it heavy. If you looked uncontrolled, people assumed you were uncontrolled. If your hair was wild, perhaps your impulses were too. If your eyes darted, perhaps your loyalty did. If your clothes were too bright, perhaps your character was unstable. This belief system made the mirror a courtroom. Every morning was preparation for trial. Women rose early to apply powder. White powder, often made from chalk or lead, spread across the face to erase warmth and create luminous paleness. Pale skin meant leisure. Leisure meant status. Status meant virtue. The logic was flawed. But it was consistent. And consistency is persuasive. Rouge was added carefully. Enough to suggest health. Not enough to suggest passion. Dark pigment framed the eyes. Large eyes implied composure. Calmness. Control. The irony, of course, was that the pigments often caused irritation. watery eyes, redness, discomfort. But Rome valued the appearance of serenity more than actual comfort. So women endured. Quietly. Hair required hours. Braids stacked upon braids. Curls pinned into architectural towers. Wigs imported from distant lands. If your hairstyle looked effortless, it meant someone else's effort was hidden beneath it. And hidden effort was the ultimate luxury. Men faced subtler, but no less exhausting, standards. They were expected to appear naturally correct. Hair trimmed but not styled. Beard shaved but not obsessively. Skin clean but not polished. A Roman man had to look like he had never stood in front of a mirror, while clearly benefiting from one. Too much care invited ridicule. Too little care invited disrespect. So he walked the narrowest of lines. Body hair became another silent debate. Early Rome celebrated it. Later Rome plucked it. Depilators worked in bathhouses, removing hair strand by strand. Clients endured in silence. To complain was weak. To enjoy it was suspicious. To avoid it was careless. There was no comfortable option. Even aging was scrutinized. Women were expected to maintain youth for as long as possible. Wrinkles suggested decline. Gray hair invited commentary. Dye existed. Wigs existed. But visible effort was dangerous. Men aged more gently in public opinion. Lines suggested wisdom. Gray suggested authority. But only if carried with dignity. If a man tried too hard to look young, he was mocked. Rome admired aging. It did not admire insecurity. And insecurity was easy to detect. Because Roman society thrived on reading faces. A steady gaze meant confidence. A lowered gaze meant modesty. Too much eye contact meant aggression. Too little meant deceit. Eyebrows were shaped carefully. In some periods, a connected brow was admired. Unity suggested seriousness. Separate brows suggested distraction. Women painted them in. Men were judged for grooming them. The correct brow was calm. Moderate. Unremarkable. Which is ironic. Because remarkable effort was required to look unremarkable. This constant monitoring created a culture of quiet anxiety. Not panic. Not chaos. Just a steady hum of self-awareness. Am I balanced? Am I moderate? Am I correct? Rome worshipped control. Control of empire. Control of land. Control of emotion. Control of appetite. And beauty became a visible sign of that control. A smooth face meant discipline. A controlled body meant restraint. A measured expression meant virtue. But human beings are not naturally moderate. They are inconsistent. Emotional. Changing. And so Roman citizens adjusted constantly. Powder reapplied. Hair reset. Posture corrected. Expression softened. All day. Every day. Dinner parties were performance stages. You reclined properly. You laughed gently. You gestured with restraint. Too much animation suggested instability. Too much silence suggested arrogance. You existed in a narrow band of acceptable humanity. And the reward for success? Minimal gossip. Which, in Rome, was a triumph. Because gossip was power. Reputation was currency. And beauty influenced both. If you looked controlled, people trusted you. If you looked indulgent, they hesitated. This is how aesthetics became social control. You disciplined yourself so that Rome would not discipline you. Over time, the pressure internalized. You didn't just fear judgment. You anticipated it. Corrected for it. Lived inside it. Even alone. Because once you learn to see yourself through Rome's eyes, You never fully stop. And that may be the most Roman thing of all. Beauty was never about admiration. It was about reassurance. Reassurance that society was stable. That citizens were controlled. That excess was contained. That moderation ruled. But moderation enforced too tightly becomes rigidity. Rigidity becomes anxiety. Anxiety becomes exhaustion. And exhaustion eventually cracks. Roman beauty standards did not collapse the empire. But they reveal something deeply human. The desire to control appearance when life feels unpredictable. To smooth the surface. To discipline the body. To quiet the face. As if chaos can be prevented by symmetry. As if morality can be painted on. As if composure can erase uncertainty. The Roman mirror did not ask, "Are you beautiful?" It asked, "Are you acceptable?" And that question, repeated daily across centuries, shaped lives in small, invisible ways. The woman adjusting her powder before stepping into sunlight. The man trimming his beard carefully but pretending not to care. The young girl learning which expressions were safe. The aging matron measuring the depth of new lines. The senator holding his gaze steady, even when unsure. All of them performing moderation. All of them managing perception. All of them quietly aware that in Rome, to be seen was to be evaluated. And so they balanced. Adjusted. Endured. And called it virtue. Now the lights are dim. The fan hums softly. And somewhere in ancient Rome, a woman checks her reflection one last time before entering a room. Not to admire herself. But to ensure she cannot be criticized. And that quiet, careful preparation is the true story of Roman beauty. Rest easy. Rome is no longer watching. And yet, even when Rome stopped watching from the outside, something had already shifted on the inside. Because the most powerful standards are not enforced by soldiers. They are enforced by habit. By repetition. By the quiet voice that says, "Adjust that. Stand straighter. Soften your expression. Do not laugh like that. Do not frown like that. Do not look uncertain." In Rome, children learned this early. A young girl observed her mother at the mirror. The careful dusting of powder. The measured placement of rouge. The slow construction of hair. She did not hear a lecture about virtue. She saw it. Virtue looked pale. Virtue looked composed. Virtue looked balanced. A young boy watched his father prepare for the forum. The beard trimmed just enough. The tunic adjusted to fall correctly. The gaze practiced in stillness. Confidence did not shout. It settled. It rested in the face like something trained. Children absorbed these lessons the way stone absorbs heat. Gradually. Completely. By adolescence, they understood something essential. Rome did not forgive visible imbalance. Too much joy was childish. Too much sorrow was dramatic. Too much vanity was weak. Too much indifference was dangerous. Everything had to be filtered. Even grief. Funerals in Rome were theatrical, yes. But even mourning followed rules. The correct volume. The correct posture. The correct display of sorrow. Grief could not be chaotic. It had to look dignified. Because dignity was Rome's favorite disguise. And beauty was its uniform. Even illness carried aesthetic consequences. A pale face was admirable, until it looked sick. Thinness suggested restraint, until it suggested frailty. Strength was praised, until it became brutish. Health itself had a narrow definition. Not radiant. Not glowing. Not rugged. Controlled. Contained. Moderate. This constant calibration shaped posture. Roman statues reveal something telling. Figures stand upright. Chins level. Shoulders squared. Not stiff. Not relaxed. Balanced. Statues were ideals carved in stone. Citizens were expected to approximate them in flesh. Imagine holding your face in a socially acceptable position for hours. Imagine regulating every gesture. Every blink. Every smile. Now imagine doing that for years. The body learns tension. The mind learns vigilance. And vigilance, sustained long enough, becomes identity. This is how beauty standards become invisible cages. No chains. No bars. Just expectations. Roman women, especially among the elite, lived in this space constantly. They were visible representations of their family's honor. A poorly presented woman reflected poorly on her husband, her father, her household. Her face was not entirely her own. It carried collective responsibility. And so the pressure deepened. A crack in the powder. A stray hair. A flushed cheek from heat. Each small imperfection felt amplified. Because it was never just about appearance. It was about discipline. Control. Worth. Men carried a different version of the same weight. Their faces signaled authority. Their bodies signaled capability. Their grooming signaled restraint. Too much softness undermined command. Too much aggression suggested instability. A Roman man had to look as though he ruled himself before he could rule others. Self-mastery was aesthetic. This belief tied beauty directly to power. And power, in Rome, was everything. Even the emperor was not immune. Imperial portraits were carefully crafted. Strong jaw. Calm eyes. Ageless features. Wrinkles softened. Expressions neutral. The emperor did not look anxious. Even when he was. Especially when he was. Because Rome could not afford a ruler who appeared uncertain. And so marble told a reassuring lie. Perfection in stone. Control frozen forever. But real faces are not marble. They sweat. They twitch. They age. They react. And the effort to suppress that reality required energy. Energy spent on appearance is energy not spent elsewhere. But in Rome, that trade felt necessary. Because reputation was survival. A rumor could weaken alliances. A careless impression could stall advancement. A visible flaw could become public conversation. And Roman conversation traveled quickly. In markets. In baths. In dinner gatherings lit by oil lamps. People observed. People compared. People concluded. You see how she paints her face. He plucks too much. Have you noticed his nervous smile? She looks tired. He looks vain. And these observations, whispered softly, shaped futures. A society that reads faces as moral documents cannot stop reading. Even in private moments, Romans corrected themselves. Sit straighter. Speak calmer. Do not reveal irritation. Do not reveal boredom. Control your appetite. Control your laughter. Control your eyes. Beauty, in this sense, was not decoration. It was rehearsal. Daily rehearsal for being acceptable. And here is the quiet irony. The more Rome insisted on moderation, the more obsessed it became. Because moderation requires constant measurement. And measurement invites comparison. And comparison breeds dissatisfaction. A slightly paler neighbor. A slightly more symmetrical face. A slightly more elaborate hairstyle. The competition was subtle. But persistent. And subtle competition lasts longer. It does not explode. It hums. Like the soft fan in the background tonight. Steady. Unending. Rome believed it had created order. And in many ways, it had. But beneath the order lived tension. Because humans are not symmetrical. Not perfectly restrained. Not eternally composed. They are expressive. Imperfect. Alive. And life resists strict moderation. So occasionally, cracks appeared. Fashion shifted suddenly. Hairstyles grew taller. Makeup grew heavier. Standards loosened briefly. Then tightened again. A pendulum. Swinging between indulgence and restraint. Each swing revealing anxiety. What if we drift too far? What if we appear excessive? What if we lose control? This fear of excess defined Roman beauty. Excess emotion. Excess pleasure. Excess grooming. Excess neglect. Balance was worshipped. But balance, pursued obsessively, becomes imbalance. And perhaps that is the quiet tragedy beneath Roman elegance. A civilization so determined to appear controlled, that it rarely allowed itself to simply be. In the end, Roman beauty standards did not exist to inspire admiration. They existed to prevent disorder. A calm face suggested a calm society. A disciplined body suggested disciplined citizens. An orderly appearance suggested an orderly empire. But no empire is sustained by powder alone. No civilization is stabilized by symmetrical brows. And yet, for centuries, Romans believed, consciously or not, that if they could maintain the surface, the structure beneath would hold. So they powdered. They plucked. They adjusted. They endured. And called it virtue. Now the lamps burn low. The marble statues stand silent. The mirrors are dark. And the Roman citizen, finally alone, exhales. For a moment. No one is watching. No one is decoding. No one is measuring. And in that brief stillness, free from the tribunal of beauty, there is something almost radical. A face at rest. Untested. Unjudged. Simply human. And perhaps that, more than moderation, more than symmetry, more than pale perfection, was the one thing Rome never quite learned how to value. Rest now. The forum is quiet. The judgments have paused. And for tonight, no one is evaluating your eyebrows. And still, even in the quiet, the habits remain. Because once a society teaches you that your face is a verdict, you begin delivering the verdict yourself. A Roman woman waking before dawn does not need an audience to feel pressure. The mirror is enough. A Roman man adjusting his tunic does not need a critic. He has already memorized the rules. This is how standards survive centuries. Not through force, but through familiarity. Through repetition so steady it feels natural. Rome called this discipline. But discipline, when constant, becomes vigilance. And vigilance is tiring. Imagine walking through the Roman Forum at midday. The sun high. Voices layered over one another. Merchants calling. Senators debating. Children weaving through the crowd. And everywhere, eyes. Faces assessing faces. Not maliciously. Not loudly. Just habitually. You pass a matron with towering curls pinned precisely in place. Her skin pale despite the heat. Her posture regal. She notices your sandals first. Then your hemline. Then your expression. Not intentionally cruel. Just trained. A soldier stands near a fountain. Arms folded. Jaw set. He scans the crowd with practiced calm. But even he is being scanned. Is his beard trimmed evenly? Does he carry himself with authority or fatigue? Does he look disciplined? Or merely tired? The judgments are small. Micro-evaluations. But small judgments accumulate. They shape invitations. Opportunities. Alliances. Rome was not only a political machine. It was a social one. And social machines run on perception. Perception needed symbols. Beauty became one of them. Pale skin symbolized leisure. Leisure symbolized class. Class symbolized power. Power symbolized virtue. The chain was simple. Flawed. But effective. And the further you fell from the ideal, the harder you had to compensate. A woman of modest means might over-apply powder to appear higher status. A man of uncertain authority might exaggerate his composure. Someone aging might overcorrect signs of time. But overcorrection was dangerous. Because excess was suspicious. So correction had to look effortless. And effortlessness required effort. There is something almost mathematical about it. Add restraint. Subtract emotion. Divide by moderation. Multiply by appearance. Equal respectability. But humans are not equations. They fluctuate. They feel. They react. Roman society tolerated emotion only when choreographed. A triumphant general could display pride. A grieving widow could display sorrow. But in daily life, emotion had to be filtered. Contained. Measured. Your face was not a diary. It was a public notice. And what happens when you live long enough inside that notice? You forget what your unfiltered expression looks like. Imagine a Roman woman, older now. Her youth faded. Her routines perfected. She powders automatically. Lines softened. Cheeks tinted. Hair arranged. But in a rare moment, perhaps late at night, she catches her reflection without preparation. No pigment. No structure. No performance. Does she recognize herself? Or does she recognize the mask more clearly? Because masks, worn long enough, feel like skin. Men faced a quieter version of this question. Roman masculinity demanded composure. Authority. Gravitas. The word itself suggests weight. A heavy seriousness. A man who laughed too freely risked appearing frivolous. A man who smiled too often risked appearing unserious. So he moderated. Even joy required calibration. He learned which stories to tell. Which gestures to soften. Which reactions to suppress. He learned to maintain a steady gaze. Even when uncertain. Even when afraid. And fear existed. Rome was powerful. But power breeds paranoia. Political alliances shifted. Fortunes rose and fell. Exile was possible. Disgrace was possible. And in such a society, control of appearance felt like control of destiny. If you could not control events, you could at least control your expression. The empire expanded. Trade routes widened. Foreign fashions entered Rome. New textures. New colors. New ideas of beauty. And each new influence created tension. Too foreign looked un-Roman. Too traditional looked outdated. Rome prided itself on absorbing cultures. But socially, it absorbed carefully. Filtering what could be adopted without destabilizing the ideal. Because beneath the elegance was fear. Fear of decline. Fear of decadence. Fear that indulgence would weaken discipline. Beauty standards became a defense mechanism. A visual reassurance that Rome was still Rome. Still balanced. Still restrained. Still superior. But superiority built on surfaces is fragile. When emperors grew decadent, their portraits did not show it. When politics grew unstable, the statues remained serene. The face of Rome stayed composed. Even as cracks widened. This is what makes the psychology fascinating. A society obsessed with moderation sometimes produces excess in secret. Private indulgence. Public restraint. Private insecurity. Public confidence. The gap between the two can widen quietly. Until it feels heavy. And heaviness, sustained, reshapes a culture. Yet through it all, daily life continued. Women visiting baths, discussing new powders. Men debating politics while adjusting their cloaks. Young people learning by observation. Older citizens reinforcing norms without speaking them aloud. The beauty tribunal never adjourned. It simply softened at night. Only to resume in the morning. And here we are. Centuries later. Looking back. It is easy to smile at Roman anxieties. The obsession with brows. With paleness. With hair. But beneath the details lies something familiar. The desire to appear acceptable. The fear of visible flaw. The performance of composure. Rome's standards were specific. But the psychology was universal. Control appearance. Project stability. Hide vulnerability. And hope that the surface is convincing enough. Now the oil lamps dim further. The marble cools. The forum empties. A Roman citizen walks home beneath a darkening sky. No crowd. No observers. Just footsteps echoing softly. For a brief stretch of street, no one is measuring posture. No one is decoding expression. No one is ranking virtue by symmetry. In that stretch, there is relief. Shoulders lower slightly. The face relaxes. Not dramatically. Just enough. And that small relaxation, that quiet release from being evaluated, might have been the most precious luxury in all of Rome. Not gold. Not silk. Not imported hair. But a moment unobserved. A face unexamined. A body allowed to exist without interpretation. And perhaps that is where we leave them tonight. In the stillness. Free, briefly, from the invisible courtroom of beauty. The empire sleeps. The mirrors are dark. And no one, for now, is keeping score. And yet, even in sleep, the standards linger. Because when a culture repeats something long enough, it becomes instinct. A Roman child does not need to be told, sit properly. They have seen what happens to those who do not. A Roman woman does not need to be reminded to soften her expression before entering a gathering. Her muscles adjust automatically. A Roman man does not consciously calculate how firm his handshake should be, how steady his gaze must remain. He has practiced since youth. This is how beauty standards move from fashion into identity. They settle into the spine. Into the jaw. Into the way one breathes in public. Rome did not invent insecurity. But it refined it. It structured it. It moralized it. If you failed to meet expectations, it was not merely aesthetic failure. It was personal failure. Moral failure. A sign of weak discipline. And discipline, to Rome, was the foundation of civilization itself. This belief gave beauty a strange seriousness. It was not playful. It was not experimental. It was cautious. Measured. Heavy. Consider the baths, those grand social spaces where citizens gathered daily. Steam rising. Marble floors damp beneath sandaled feet. Conversations drifting lazily through the air. Even there, relaxation had rules. Bodies were seen. Compared. Assessed. A man entering the bathhouse might pretend indifference. But he was aware. Aware of how his physique compared. Aware of whether his grooming signaled refinement or excess. Aware of scars. Of age. Of softness. Women in private bathing spaces faced similar quiet comparisons. Skin tone. Body shape. Hair removal. Youth. Each detail catalogued silently. No announcements. No formal ranking. Just awareness. And awareness is enough. Over time, the effort to maintain moderation shaped choices beyond appearance. Food portions. Wine consumption. Speech patterns. Everything folded back into that central Roman virtue, control. Too much appetite suggested indulgence. Too little suggested weakness. The ideal Roman citizen appeared balanced in every measurable way. Balance became identity. But balance is exhausting when pursued relentlessly. Imagine never being allowed to be messy. Not in emotion. Not in appearance. Not in ambition. Rome feared excess because excess implied instability. And instability threatened order. So individuals became miniature empires of self-regulation. Policing their own faces. Their own gestures. Their own desires. A woman who laughed too loudly might notice the pause that followed. A man who expressed too much enthusiasm might catch a raised eyebrow. Correction happened subtly. A small shift in tone next time. A quieter laugh. A firmer jaw. Over years, these micro-adjustments accumulate. They sculpt personality. And eventually, people forget which parts are performance. Because the performance has been running for decades. But cracks always appear. In private letters, historians find hints of insecurity. Complaints about aging. About hair loss. About weight. About the cruelty of gossip. Even in the most disciplined society, humans confessed. Softly. In ink. Behind closed doors. This tells us something important. Rome's beauty standards were powerful. But they were not painless. Behind the pale faces and composed gazes were ordinary fears. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of decline. Fear of public embarrassment. Fear of losing status. And these fears were not confined to women. They moved through every layer of society. A senator feared appearing weak. A soldier feared appearing soft. A merchant feared appearing desperate. A young bride feared appearing inadequate. Even emperors feared appearing mortal. That is perhaps the most revealing part. Roman statues of emperors rarely show fragility. They show calm dominance. Eternal youth. Unshakable confidence. Because if the emperor appeared flawed, the illusion of control weakened. And Rome could not tolerate that. So marble carried the burden of perfection. While flesh carried the burden of anxiety. It is easy to imagine Rome as bold and loud. Conquests. Crowds. Triumphs. But socially, it was restrained. Measured. Obsessed with the middle path. And that obsession reveals vulnerability. A society secure in itself does not need constant visual reassurance. A society anxious about decline does. Beauty became reassurance. Proof that discipline remained intact. Proof that citizens were not slipping into chaos. Proof that Rome was still superior. But proof must be maintained. Daily. Hourly. And maintenance wears people down. So what did Romans do for relief? Small rebellions. Private moments of indulgence. Laughter among trusted friends. Clothing slightly more colorful at home. Hair loosened at night. Makeup wiped away in solitude. Tiny freedoms. Brief departures from the script. Because no one can perform moderation every second. Even Rome understood that. Though it rarely admitted it publicly. And eventually. History shifted. The empire strained. Politics fractured. Values evolved. Beauty standards changed, as they always do. But the underlying psychology remained. The belief that appearance reflects virtue. That control equals worth. That balance must be visible. And as we look back tonight, in this quiet space far removed from marble forums and oil lamps, we can see the pattern. Humans trying to manage uncertainty through surfaces. Trying to quiet fear with symmetry. Trying to prove stability through posture. Rome was not uniquely vain. It was uniquely systematic. It codified insecurity. Wrapped it in philosophy. And called it civilization. Now the night deepens. The streets of Rome are empty. The bathhouses silent. The mirrors covered. The powder settled. For a few hours, no one performs. No one corrects their brow. No one measures their composure. They sleep. Faces relaxed. Unarranged. Unobserved. And in sleep, they are free from judgment. Free from moderation. Free from the invisible scales weighing every gesture. Perhaps that was the only time Roman beauty standards truly disappeared. When eyes closed. When expressions softened without consequence. When control loosened. And humanity, imperfect, asymmetrical, emotional, quietly returned. So rest now. Let the forum fade. Let the statues stand still in the dark. Let the tribunal of eyebrows adjourn. There is no need to balance yourself tonight. No need to perform composure. No need to appear moderate. The empire is quiet. The lamps are out. And no one. Not senator. Not matron. Not emperor. Is watching. And when morning came, it began again. Not dramatically. Not with trumpets. Just with light. Thin strands of sunlight slipping between shutters. Dust lifting in the air. A Roman household stirring back to consciousness. A woman rises first. She moves quietly. Not because she must. But because habit has trained her movements to be measured. Even alone, she stands straight. Even alone, she smooths her hair before walking past polished bronze. The mirror does not accuse. It reflects. And reflection is enough. Water touches her face. Cool. Awakening. For a brief second, there is no powder. No correction. Just skin. Just breath. But Rome does not admire the unprepared. So preparation begins. White powder tapped gently across cheeks. Blended carefully to avoid obvious lines. Rouge applied with caution. Too much invites whispers. Too little invites speculation. Eyes darkened, not to seduce, but to steady. Brows adjusted. Balanced. Unified. Hair lifted. Pinned. Stacked. Constructed into something that suggests effort without revealing it. And in the next room, a man wakes. He sits on the edge of his bed for a moment. Not admiring himself. Assessing. Beard trimmed. Not sculpted. Hair neatened. Not styled. Tunics chosen. Fabric smooth. Unwrinkled. Nothing flamboyant. Nothing careless. He will enter the world as composed. And the world will respond accordingly. This daily ritual is not vanity. It is armor. Because outside, the forum waits. The market waits. Neighbors wait. Rome does not begin the day with kindness. It begins with evaluation. Footsteps echo against stone streets. Voices rise. Merchants lift their goods. Senators gather in shaded porticos. Women move in small clusters, parasols raised against the sun. The city feels alive. But beneath the activity lies calibration. Every interaction carries subtle measurement. A glance held a second too long. A smile too wide. A garment too bold. Each deviation noted. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Just registered. And registration shapes memory. Reputation is a delicate thing in Rome. Built slowly. Damaged quickly. So citizens manage impressions carefully. A man speaking in the forum keeps his tone steady. He avoids too much passion. Passion suggests instability. He gestures, but not wildly. He pauses, but not awkwardly. Even rhetoric has aesthetic rules. A woman visiting a friend comments gently on her hairstyle. Too effusive and she appears insincere. Too quiet and she appears jealous. Everything exists in that narrow band of moderation. Rome's favorite space. And yet, underneath the moderation, emotion lives. Ambition. Jealousy. Desire. Fatigue. Doubt. They do not disappear. They compress. Contained beneath composed faces. Contained beneath powdered skin. Contained beneath neatly arranged curls. Compression creates pressure. Pressure seeks release. Sometimes it emerges as satire. Poets mock excessive grooming. Writers tease the overpowdered matron. Humor becomes a safe outlet. A way to criticize standards without dismantling them. Sometimes pressure emerges as fashion shifts. Sudden trends toward extravagance. Taller hair. Brighter fabrics. Bolder cosmetics. Almost as if society exhales too forcefully after holding its breath too long. Then, inevitably, restraint returns. Critics complain. Voices call for moderation. And the pendulum swings back. Balance restored. For a while. It is important to understand something subtle. Roman beauty standards were not enforced by law. No decree demanded pale skin. No official punishment awaited imperfect brows. But social consequence can feel heavier than legal consequence. Exclusion. Mockery. Reduced marriage prospects. Stalled careers. Lost influence. These were real. And so compliance felt wise. Practical. Necessary. In this way, Rome achieved control without chains. The citizens did the work themselves. Adjusted themselves. Policed themselves. Carried the weight voluntarily. Because belonging mattered. And belonging required fitting the mold. Even slaves and lower classes felt echoes of these standards. Though their resources were limited, imitation occurred. Simpler powders. Basic grooming. Efforts to appear aligned with Roman ideals. Because aspiration flows downward. Standards trickle. And even those outside the elite understood the language of appearance. To look Roman was to claim dignity. To look disordered was to risk dismissal. As centuries passed, the empire expanded further. Foreign faces filled Roman streets. New textures. New complexions. New aesthetics. The original ideals stretched. Adapted. Sometimes resisted. Sometimes absorbed. But always evaluated. Because Rome did not simply conquer territory. It absorbed and categorized it. And appearance remained a primary category. Still, beneath all of it, one truth remained unchanged. Humans longed to relax. To be unmeasured. To laugh without adjusting their brows. To eat without calculating moderation. To age without disguising it. To stand without performing balance. Perhaps in countryside villas, away from the forum's scrutiny, this happened more freely. Perhaps in trusted circles, faces softened more easily. Perhaps in dim candlelight, after guests departed, women wiped away powder with relief. Men loosened tunics. Posture slackened. Voices warmed. Those moments were not recorded in marble. They left no statues. But they were real. And they mattered. Because perfection is unsustainable. And no civilization, however disciplined, can eliminate humanity entirely. Rome's beauty standards reveal both strength and fragility. Strength in their consistency. Fragility in their necessity. A society confident in its stability does not need every citizen's face to confirm it. But Rome sought confirmation everywhere. In posture. In grooming. In symmetry. In moderation. And that search tells us something quietly vulnerable about even the mightiest empire. Now, as night approaches again in our slow drifting journey, the day winds down. Shops close. Voices soften. Oil lamps flicker back to life. A Roman citizen catches their reflection one final time before sleep. Not to impress. Not to perform. Just to look. Truly look. Without correction. Without adjustment. Without the silent tribunal. And perhaps, in that final glance, there is a fleeting recognition. That beneath the powder. Beneath the restraint. Beneath the practiced composure. There exists something far older than Rome. A human face. Uneven. Expressive. Alive. And that face, free from evaluation, is softer than marble. Stronger than expectation. And far more enduring than any empire. So rest now. The streets are quiet again. The standards paused. The judgment sleeping. And in the stillness, no one is decoding your posture. No one is measuring your symmetry. No one is adjusting your brows. For this moment, you are not a document. Not a verdict. Not a performance. Just human. And that is enough. And when morning comes, the performance begins again. Sandals against stone. Doors opening. Voices measured before they are even spoken. Because daylight in Rome was not just illumination. It was exposure. To be seen was to be evaluated. To be evaluated was to be placed somewhere on an invisible scale. And everyone understood the scale. It did not need to be written. It lived in glances. In pauses. In the subtle tightening of lips when someone walked past. The young felt it most sharply. A boy standing at the edge of manhood. Shoulders not yet broad. Voice not yet steady. He studies older men carefully. How they hold themselves. How they laugh without seeming foolish. How they express confidence without arrogance. He copies them. Adjusts. Tries again. A girl nearing adulthood watches the women of her household. How they arrange their hair. How they lower their eyes just enough. How they speak firmly without seeming harsh. She learns the rhythm. The boundaries. The narrow path between too much and too little. And so the standard passes quietly from one generation to the next. Not enforced with violence. But with repetition. With example. With the gentle, relentless power of expectation. Even celebrations followed this logic. At feasts, abundance was displayed, but control remained visible. Wine flowed, yet the truly admired guest did not lose composure. Food was plentiful, yet gluttony was whispered about afterward. Excess was tempting. Excess was human. But excess was dangerous. Because it hinted at cracks in discipline. And discipline was Rome's sacred thread. Pull it too hard, and the whole garment might unravel. So moderation became armor. Politeness became shield. Composure became currency. The result? A society that admired strength, but feared vulnerability. That praised dignity, but struggled with authenticity. Yet beneath the marble statues and polished rhetoric, the human heart remained unchanged. It still longed for approval. Still feared exclusion. Still compared. Still doubted. A matron might spend hours preparing her appearance, only to wonder privately if it was enough. A senator might deliver a flawless speech, then replay a single misplaced word in his mind all night. A soldier might boast among comrades, yet silently worry his body no longer looks as it once did. Perfection was never achieved. It was only approached. And approaching it was a lifelong occupation. This is the quiet truth about standards of beauty in Rome. They were less about beauty, and more about belonging. To look right was to signal you understood the code. That you respected order. That you were not a threat to stability. It was social harmony disguised as aesthetics. And when someone stepped outside those expectations, whispers, caricatures, satirical poems, public commentary. Rome was witty, sharp-tongued. Its humor often sliced at appearance. Large noses exaggerated in drawings. Weight mocked in plays. Vanity ridiculed in speeches. Laughter kept the boundaries intact. Because ridicule is a powerful tool. It corrects without formal punishment. It teaches without instruction. And most importantly, it spreads quickly. No one wanted to be the subject of the joke. So they adjusted. Smoothed edges. Muted colors. Balanced ambition. Even art reinforced the message. Statues emphasized symmetry. Reliefs showed calm faces in moments of chaos. Portrait busts highlighted seriousness over softness. The ideal Roman face was composed. Alert. Rational. Never overly emotional. Emotion was unstable. Reason was Roman. And to appear rational was beautiful. But humanity is not always rational. It trembles. It blushes. It falters. And so a quiet tension always existed between the ideal and the real. That tension is not uniquely Roman. It lives in every era. Every culture. Every time a mirror becomes more than glass. Rome simply gave it structure. Language. Philosophy. And marble form. Yet, centuries later, the empire faded. Columns cracked. Forums emptied. Standards shifted. New ideals rose from the ruins. And what does that tell us? That no beauty code is eternal. No standard is fixed. What feels absolute in one century becomes curious in another. The pale skin once prized. The tightly controlled expression. The strict moderation in all things. They belonged to their time. And they passed with it. But the deeper impulse. To shape appearance into proof of worth. That endured. Because it is older than Rome. And younger than tomorrow. It is human. So as this long night closes. Imagine walking alone through a quiet Roman street. No crowds. No expectations. No watchful eyes. Just stone beneath your feet and moonlight on ancient walls. You pause beside a still pool of water. You see your reflection. Not adjusted. Not arranged. Not judged. Just you. And in that reflection, there is no senate. No satire. No standard. Only a face that carries history. Emotion. Imperfection. And life. Perhaps that is the truest beauty Rome ever knew. Though it rarely said so aloud. The beauty of being unobserved. Unmeasured. Unranked. For a moment, the empire dissolves. And what remains is simply human. And long after the footsteps fade. After the last torch gutters out. After even the stray dogs curl into the warmth of hidden corners. There is a stillness that no empire can command. In that stillness, Rome is not marble. Not law. Not hierarchy. It is breath. Slow. Even. Human. Because when all observation disappears, what remains is not performance. It is existence. The young man no longer straightens his shoulders. The matron no longer calculates her expression. The senator no longer arranges his words in silence before sleep. Their faces soften in the dark. And that softening is honest. It is uncurated. Unmanaged. In daylight, Rome demanded symmetry. At night, asymmetry returned. A crooked smile. A line of worry across the brow. A body curved in an unguarded position. Imperfection was not erased. It was merely postponed until privacy allowed it. There is something almost tender in that idea. That even the most disciplined society required hours of release. Hours when no one had to prove balance. No one had to embody virtue through posture. No one had to mirror the statues lining the forums. Because statues never yawn. They never age. They never doubt. But people do. And Rome, for all its pride and restraint, was built by people. People who blushed. Who sweated. Who worried about hair thinning or wrinkles forming. Who compared themselves quietly to neighbors. Who feared ridicule more than injury. Who longed to belong more than to dominate. Standards of beauty, in Rome, were threads in a larger tapestry. Threads of control. Threads of order. Threads of fear disguised as discipline. Yet woven among them were threads of resilience. Rome taught its citizens to observe themselves constantly. That habit could be oppressive. But it also sharpened perception. They became attentive to detail. To nuance. To gesture. To tone. They read rooms with precision. They understood that presentation shapes power. That awareness still echoes across centuries. We live in different cities now. Different systems. Different ideals. But mirrors still exist. Crowds still evaluate. Humor still polices boundaries. And moderation still carries moral weight. The Roman Forum has been replaced by other arenas. But the instinct is familiar. To adjust before entering. To edit before speaking. To refine before being seen. Rome's statues may crumble. But the psychology lingers. Yet here is the quiet relief. History shows that every standard shifts. What feels immovable eventually softens. What feels absolute eventually fades. And what remains is the same fragile, resilient human need. To be accepted. To be seen. To belong. Even Rome, with all its grandeur, could not escape that. Its citizens sought approval as intensely as they sought conquest. They sought harmony in their own reflection. They sought assurance in symmetry. But perfection was never achieved. Only pursued. And perhaps that is the final lesson whispered through ruined columns and silent amphitheaters. Standards may shape behavior. But they never fully contain humanity. Emotion leaks through. Individuality resurfaces. Imperfection persists. And that persistence is not failure. It is life. So as this long meditation draws to its quiet close, picture Rome once more at dawn. The sky paling. The first merchant opening his shutters. A woman tying her hair before stepping outside. A young man rehearsing confidence in the reflection of polished metal. The cycle begins again. Standards return with the sunlight. Composure reassembles. Moderation steps back into place. But now you know what lies beneath. The softness in the dark. The unguarded breath. The truth that even empires cannot erase. Behind every ideal face is a living one. Behind every marble statue is fragile flesh. Behind every standard is a human heart, hoping not to fall short. And that hope, that vulnerable, universal hope, is far older than Rome. Far stronger than marble. and far more enduring than any empire ever built. And if we linger just a little longer, if we refuse to let the curtain fall too quickly, we begin to notice something quieter still. Not the grand ideals. Not the marble symmetry. Not the polished rhetoric of moderation. But the small, ordinary rebellions. A woman choosing a slightly brighter dye for her garment than convention preferred. A young man letting his hair grow just a little longer before trimming it back into acceptability. A poet exaggerating flaws in satire, not just to mock others, but to expose the absurdity of perfection itself. These were not revolutions. Rome did not crumble because someone laughed too loudly. But within the rigid architecture of expectation, people carved breathing room. Tiny spaces where individuality could stretch. Because no system, no matter how disciplined, can fully suppress variation. Even in rows of Roman statues, each face differs slightly. A subtle tilt of the head. A distinct curve of the lip. An almost hidden softness in the eyes. Crafted by different hands. Guided by different visions. Uniformity was the goal. But humanity left fingerprints. And that is the paradox of Roman beauty. It demanded order. Yet it relied on artists, imperfect, emotional, subjective humans, to define that order. The ideal was shaped by those who themselves could never fully embody it. And so the standard was always slightly unstable. Always slightly shifting. Even if Rome insisted it was eternal. There is something strangely comforting in that. Because it reminds us that no ideal stands untouched by interpretation. No expectation remains pure. It is filtered through culture, through fear, through ambition, through longing. And over time, those filters change. In later centuries, people would look back at Roman statues and see different things. Strength. Severity. Elegance. Coldness. Inspiration. Oppression. The same marble, new meanings. Because standards do not only control the present. They become artifacts for the future. Clues to what a society valued. Clues to what it feared. Rome feared chaos. So it prized control. Rome feared moral decay. So it prized moderation. Rome feared instability. So it carved calm into stone. But fear is not destiny. And control is not identity. Beneath all the sculpted balance was a population as emotionally complex as any before or after. They loved passionately. Grieved deeply. Laughed loudly in private. Argued fiercely behind closed doors. They were not marble. They were warm. And warmth always resists rigid lines. Perhaps that is why empires fall. Not because standards fail. But because life keeps overflowing them. New ideas. New aesthetics. New definitions of virtue. What once signaled dignity begins to feel restrictive. What once symbolized strength begins to feel brittle. And slowly, quietly, the code loosens. Then shifts. Then disappears. Leaving behind fragments. Columns without roofs. Statues without noses. Fragments of a face that once represented perfection. Now weathered. Now softened by time. It is almost poetic. The very marble meant to preserve flawless ideals becomes cracked and incomplete. Nature erodes what society tried to freeze. And in that erosion, something gentler emerges. A reminder that permanence is an illusion. And perfection, even in stone, does not survive untouched. So what remains? Not the exact measurements of Roman beauty. Not the precise angles of acceptable posture. Not the unspoken hierarchy of pale skin and composed expression. What remains is the story. The awareness that humans have always tried to translate inner worth into outer form. That they have always struggled with comparison. Always sought balance. Always feared ridicule. always hoped to belong. Rome did not invent these impulses. It organized them, systematized them, made them visible. And in doing so, it left us a mirror. Not one made of polished bronze, but one made of history. When we look into it, we do not just see Rome. We see ourselves. Adjusting, comparing, balancing, performing. And sometimes, if we are fortunate, stepping outside the performance. Letting the shoulders drop. Letting the face rest. Letting the breath deepen without calculation. Because the truest freedom is not the absence of standards. It is the ability to exist without constantly measuring yourself against them. Rome rarely granted that freedom in public. But in private moments, it flickered. In laughter. In affection. In solitude. And those moments were real. Just as real as the statues. Just as real as the Senate. Just as real as the ideals carved into cultural memory. So as we finally allow this long journey through Roman expectations to settle. Remember this. Standards rise. Standards rule. Standards reshape behavior and identity. But they never fully conquer the human spirit. Somewhere, in every era, in every empire, in every household. Someone loosens their posture. Someone wipes away the powder. Someone smiles without calculation. And in that simple act, the weight of marble lightens. The empire grows quiet. And humanity, unbalanced and beautifully imperfect, steps forward once more. And even now, if we listen carefully, we can almost hear it. Not the roar of the Colosseum. Not the thunder of marching legions. Not the echo of speeches rising in the forum. But something softer. The quiet rustle of fabric as someone chooses what to wear. The small hesitation before stepping into a crowded space. The instinctive lift of the chin. The automatic smoothing of hair. These gestures are ancient. Older than empire. Older than Rome itself. And yet Rome refined them into ritual. It turned self-presentation into civic duty. Turned appearance into philosophy. Turned moderation into a moral compass. To the Roman mind, beauty was not decoration. It was evidence. Evidence of discipline. Evidence of upbringing. Evidence of loyalty to order. But evidence can also become burden. When every gesture proves something, spontaneity feels dangerous. When every flaw suggests weakness, vulnerability feels risky. When every excess hints at chaos, joy becomes carefully measured. And so the Roman citizen walked a narrow road. Too much color. Suspicion. Too much laughter. Questionable restraint. Too much pride. Arrogance. Too much humility. Weakness. The ideal hovered somewhere in the middle. Balanced. Controlled. Composed. But the middle is a difficult place to live forever. It requires constant awareness. Constant adjustment. Constant calculation. Imagine the mental energy required to remain perpetually appropriate. To weigh your words before they form. To monitor your posture without thinking. To anticipate judgment before it arrives. This is not merely aesthetic pressure. It is psychological architecture. Rome built roads across continents. Aqueducts across valleys. Laws across cultures. But it also built invisible structures inside its people. Frameworks of self-evaluation. Columns of expectation. Archways of social comparison. And those structures lasted longer than many of its buildings. Because once internalized, they do not require enforcement. They sustain themselves. That may be Rome's most enduring legacy. Not conquest. Not architecture. Not even law. But the idea that outward balance reflects inward virtue. It is a seductive idea. It promises control in a chaotic world. It promises dignity amid uncertainty. It promises stability when everything else trembles. Yet life is not always balanced. Grief is not moderate. Love is not symmetrical. Fear is not composed. Joy is rarely measured. And so real human experience constantly pressed against Rome's ideal frame. Sometimes gently. Sometimes forcefully. A widow's raw sorrow could not be perfectly arranged. A victorious general's pride could not always be restrained. A young lover's excitement could not be entirely moderated. Emotion leaked through the cracks. It always does. And perhaps that is why Roman literature, their private letters, their poems, their confessions, feels so alive centuries later. Because beneath the polished surface, the heart still beat loudly. Still uncertain. Still yearning. Still fragile. The standards shaped behavior. But they never eliminated humanity. They simply made it more careful. More strategic. More aware. Now imagine standing at the edge of the Roman world as it begins to fade. The discipline still there. The statues still upright. The expectations still circulating in whispers and glances. But cracks forming. Economic strain. Political unrest. Cultural blending. As the empire shifts, so do its ideals. What once symbolized virtue begins to look rigid. What once seemed dignified begins to feel distant. What once defined beauty begins to feel incomplete. And slowly, new interpretations emerge. Softness redefined. Strength reconsidered. Expression allowed more room. Standards loosen. Then reform. Then loosen again. Because no society holds one image of perfection forever. That is the final, quiet truth Rome leaves behind. Beauty codes are temporary. They feel absolute in their time. They feel natural. Inevitable. Unquestionable. But centuries pass. And what was once mandatory becomes curious. What was once ideal becomes optional. What was once feared becomes ordinary. Yet the deeper pattern remains. Humans still seek belonging. Still fear ridicule. Still adjust before entering a room. The stage may change. The audience may change. The costumes may change. But the instinct to be accepted persists. And perhaps that is not weakness. Perhaps it is connection. After all, standards arise because humans live together. We signal to one another. We interpret one another. We negotiate identity in shared spaces. Rome simply codified that negotiation with unusual intensity. It made the invisible visible. Turned subtle social cues into structured ideals. And in doing so, it revealed something universal. We are always, in some way, performing. Not falsely. Not maliciously. But socially. Adjusting to context. Balancing individuality with belonging. The problem comes only when performance replaces self entirely. When marble becomes mask. When composure becomes cage. Rome danced near that edge. Sometimes gracefully. Sometimes rigidly. But always humanly. And so, as our long reflection finally settles into silence. Picture one last Roman citizen standing before a polished bronze mirror. The reflection looks back. Carefully arranged. Composed. Acceptable. Then, slowly, they exhale. The shoulders drop. The face softens. The eyes lose their practiced sharpness. For a brief second, no empire exists. No standard. No expectation. Only a person. Breathing. And in that breath is something greater than discipline. Greater than moderation. Greater than marble. It is the quiet resilience of being human. Empires rise with standards. Empires fall with time. But humanity, imperfect, expressive, vulnerable, endures. And if we follow that breath a little further, past the mirror, past the doorway, past the stone streets still cool with dawn, we begin to understand something even Rome could not fully articulate. Standards are loud in public. But identity is formed in private. A boy practicing his posture in the courtyard may imitate strength. But the courage he gathers before doing so, that is his own. A woman adjusting her veil before stepping into the market may follow expectation. But the thoughts moving behind her steady gaze, those are uniquely hers. Rome could shape appearance. It could reward composure. It could elevate moderation into virtue. But it could never fully command the inner world. And that inner world, invisible, emotional, complex, is where true humanity lived. Perhaps that is why even in the most disciplined eras, art survives. Not the official statues. Not the approved expressions of dignity. But the small frescoes in quiet homes. The scratched messages on walls. The personal letters never meant for public display. In those spaces, you find laughter that is less controlled. Love that is less measured. Fear that is less hidden. You find people being people. Rome's beauty standards sought order. And order has power. It builds roads. It organizes cities. It stabilizes governments. But life is not built entirely from order. It is built from contradiction. From spontaneity. From imbalance that leads to growth. A child stumbles before walking confidently. An artist experiments before refining. A society questions before evolving. Rome's ideal face was calm and rational. But history shows us that progress rarely looks calm. It looks uncertain. It looks messy. It looks brave in its willingness to change. And that is something marble can never fully capture. If you walk today through the ruins of ancient Rome, through broken columns and scattered stone, you do not see perfection. You see weathering. You see erosion softening sharp edges. You see time reshaping what once insisted on permanence. There is quiet poetry in that. The same culture that valued controlled symmetry now rests in asymmetrical fragments. The same empire that prized flawless composure is remembered through cracked statues and worn inscriptions. Time, gently but persistently, humbled perfection. And yet, what remains is still beautiful. Not because it is flawless, but because it endured. Perhaps that is the gentlest lesson Rome offers us across centuries. Beauty is not only in control. It is in survival. Not only in symmetry. But in resilience. Not only in moderation. But in authenticity. Rome believed that outward balance reflected inward virtue. But history suggests something else. It is adaptability that preserves civilizations. It is flexibility that allows survival. It is the willingness to soften, to shift, to reimagine. That keeps humanity moving forward. So when we think of Roman standards of beauty now, we can hold them gently. Not as rigid commandments. Not as superior ideals. But as reflections of a society trying to make sense of itself. Trying to create stability in uncertain times. Trying to express values through visible form. And in that effort, they were not so different from us. Because every generation creates its own marble. Its own definition of acceptable. Its own measurement of dignity. Its own invisible scale. But every generation also discovers, eventually, that humanity cannot be fully contained within those lines. That joy resists strict moderation. That grief refuses neat arrangement. That individuality finds cracks in every wall. And when it does, the culture shifts. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But gradually. Like stone wearing smooth under wind and rain. Rome's statues once gleamed with authority. Now they stand softened by centuries. Still dignified. But no longer rigid. And maybe that is fitting. Because true strength is not unbending. It is enduring. True beauty is not flawless. It is alive. So as our long reflection finally settles into quiet stillness, let Rome rest where it belongs. In history, in marble, in memory. And carry forward the deeper understanding it leaves behind. Standards will always exist. But they are temporary. What lasts is the human capacity to adapt, to feel, to belong, and to grow. Empires may demand perfection. But humanity thrives in its gentle imperfections. And in the end, it is not the statue that defines us. It is the breath behind it. And so we arrive at the quietest part of the story. The part Rome never carved into stone. Because stone prefers certainty. And this part is softer than certainty. It is the understanding that every standard, no matter how powerful, is a response to fear. Fear of chaos. Fear of decline. Fear of being forgotten. Rome feared becoming ordinary. So it built grandeur. It disciplined bodies. It refined faces into symbols of control. If the citizen looked composed, the empire felt secure. If the citizen appeared balanced, the state seemed stable. But no society can permanently silence uncertainty. Uncertainty is woven into time itself. Harvests fail. Leaders change. Borders shift. Generations question what they inherit. And when that happens, appearance alone cannot hold everything together. Marble cannot prevent transformation. It can only witness it. Imagine one last evening in a Roman household centuries after the empire's peak. The furniture still arranged with care. The clothing still chosen with thought. The posture still mindful. But outside, the world has changed. Trade routes altered. Languages mixing. Old titles carrying less authority. The mirror still hangs on the wall. But what it reflects no longer guarantees power. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the pressure eases. Not because people stop caring. But because they begin caring about different things. Strength shifts from rigid composure to adaptability. Dignity shifts from strict moderation to resilience. Beauty shifts from flawless control to expressive individuality. It does not happen overnight. It never does. But the change arrives like dawn. Gradual, steady, undeniable. This is the cycle Rome teaches us. Standards rise to create order. Order provides stability. Stability breeds confidence. Confidence sometimes hardens into rigidity. Rigidity meets reality. Reality reshapes everything. And through it all, people continue living. Laughing. Aging. Falling in love. Worrying about how they are perceived. Trying to belong. Because beneath every empire is the same human rhythm. Heartbeat. Breath. Hope. Rome's standards of beauty once felt immovable. But they were only one chapter in a much longer human story. Today, we study them. Analyze them. Walk among their ruins. And in doing so, we realize something humbling. What feels absolute now will one day feel distant. What feels mandatory now will one day feel curious. What feels like the definition of worth will one day be reconsidered. And that realization is freeing. Because it reminds us that we are not obligated to become statues. We are not required to freeze ourselves into permanence. We are allowed to evolve. Rome wanted eternity. What it achieved instead was influence. And influence is softer. More flexible. More human. Its columns cracked. Its forums emptied. Its beauty codes dissolved into history. But its story endures. A story of ambition. Of discipline. Of the desire to turn chaos into symmetry. And within that story, a quiet reminder. Perfection is a momentary illusion. Humanity is the constant. So if you close your eyes now and picture Rome one final time, do not see only marble faces and measured expressions. See the people beneath them. The tired mother adjusting her child's tunic. The young man practicing confidence before stepping into public life. The elder reflecting on years spent maintaining dignity. See their effort. See their vulnerability. See their humanity. Because that is what survived. Not flawless symmetry. Not eternal composure. But the persistent, adaptable, imperfect human spirit. Empires seek to define beauty. Time gently redefines it. And humanity, breathing, feeling, changing, moves forward regardless. The lamps go out. The marble cools. The echoes fade. But the breath remains. And even after the breath settles, after the echoes fade into distances too far to measure, there is still one final truth lingering in the quiet. Rome believed it could shape permanence. Through law. Through architecture. Through discipline. Through beauty carefully defined and carefully enforced. And for a time, it worked. Order held. Standards guided behavior. Citizens aligned themselves with an ideal that promised stability. But permanence is never something humans truly possess. What we possess instead is continuity. Not the frozen image. But the ongoing story. Rome's statues once stood as declarations. This is virtue. This is strength. This is beauty. Yet centuries later, those same statues stand differently. Not as commands. But as questions. What did they value? What did they fear? Why did symmetry matter so much? And in asking those questions, we are no longer controlled by their standards. We are learning from them. That may be the most powerful transformation of all. An ideal that once governed behavior becomes an artifact that inspires reflection. A code that once restricted becomes a lesson in adaptability. A standard that once measured worth becomes a reminder of how fluid worth truly is. Rome's citizens woke each morning aware of watchful eyes. We wake today aware of different ones. The setting has changed. The materials have changed. The vocabulary of beauty has changed. But the internal dialogue is familiar. Am I balanced enough? Am I strong enough? Am I acceptable? Those whispers are ancient. They walked Roman streets. They lingered in bathhouses. They hovered in marketplaces and private courtyards. And they still whisper now. But here is what Rome, in its rise and fall, ultimately reveals. No whisper is eternal. What seems overwhelming in one era softens in another. What feels defining today will someday feel historical. And beneath every standard, no matter how strict, there is always room for breath. Breath cannot be sculpted. It cannot be standardized. It cannot be moderated into symmetry. It is messy. Rhythmic. Alive. Rome built aqueducts to control water. Roads to control movement. Laws to control behavior. But even Rome could not control time. Time loosened the grip of its ideals. Time softened its edges. Time allowed new interpretations to rise. And time will do the same to every standard that feels immovable now. That realization is not meant to dismiss Rome's discipline. Discipline built wonders. Moderation created cohesion. Shared ideals fostered belonging. But when ideals harden into cages, history gently unlocks the door. Rome's beauty standards once defined citizenship. Now they define a chapter. A chapter studied, admired, questioned. And chapters are not prisons. They are pages in a longer narrative. So if there is one final image to hold as this long reflection closes, let it be this. A Roman statue standing beneath open sky. Weathered. Nose chipped. Surface worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Once it symbolized flawless virtue. Now it symbolizes endurance. Its perfection faded. Its humanity, strangely, became clearer. Because in its cracks, we see time. In its erosion, we see change. In its survival, we see resilience. And resilience, not rigid symmetry, is the truest form of beauty any civilization can claim. Rome reached for eternity through marble. Humanity achieves it through adaptation. Through the quiet willingness to shift. To soften. To grow. The empire sleeps. The standards rest. The marble cools beneath endless sky. And what remains? What has always remained? Is the simple, persistent rhythm of being human. And if we sit with that rhythm just a little longer, we begin to notice how small it is. Not small in importance. Small in sound. It does not thunder like armies. It does not echo like speeches in the forum. It does not gleam like polished marble under sunlight. It is quieter than all of that. A heartbeat in a chest beneath a linen tunic. A slow inhale before stepping into the street. A private thought no one else will ever hear. Rome could legislate conduct. It could reward discipline. It could immortalize an ideal in stone. But it could never fully enter that private space. And that private space is where freedom always begins. Even in the height of the empire, when standards felt immovable, there were moments no code could reach. A silent prayer whispered at dusk. A joke shared softly between friends. A tear wiped away before anyone noticed. A grin that refused to stay moderate. These were not acts of rebellion. They were simply acts of being human. And humanity is never perfectly symmetrical. It tilts. It trembles. It overflows. Rome tried to teach balance in all things. And balance has wisdom in it. But life is not a statue posed in stillness. It is motion. It is adaptation. It is breath that quickens and slows without permission. Perhaps that is why the ruins of Rome feel different than the Rome of its own time. In its height, it demanded admiration. In its ruins, it invites reflection. Walk through the remains of the Roman Forum today, and you do not feel judged. You feel history. Columns broken. Stones scattered. Sky visible where ceilings once stood. The space is open now. Air moves freely where expectations once pressed heavily. The same structures that once reinforced social order now offer something gentler, perspective. Time has softened authority into memory. And memory does not command. It teaches. The marble faces that once defined virtue now stand incomplete. Their missing features remind us that no image survives untouched. No ideal remains whole forever. And in that incompleteness, there is unexpected comfort. Because if even Rome's vision of perfection could weather and change, so can any standard we encounter. So can any expectation that feels heavy. So can any invisible scale measuring worth. The lesson was never that standards are evil. They organize societies. They create shared understanding. They offer stability in uncertain times. But they are tools, not truths. They are scaffolding, not the building itself. And when scaffolding becomes too rigid, history eventually removes it, leaving the core intact. Human connection. Human resilience. Human breath. Rome rose. Rome disciplined itself. Rome defined beauty with precision. And Rome changed. That change was not failure. It was continuity in a different form. Because the people did not vanish. They evolved. Their descendants carried forward stories, ideas, fragments of culture. But not the exact measurements of acceptable posture or ideal complexion. Those faded. What endured was the deeper inheritance. The awareness that societies shape appearance to reflect values. And the equally important awareness that values themselves shift. So now, as this long meditation finally draws to its quiet end, picture Rome not as marble. Not as empire. Not as rigid symmetry. But as a moment in the long human effort to understand itself. A civilization trying to create order in a chaotic world. Trying to embody virtue through visible form. Trying to reassure itself that balance meant safety. In that effort, it was neither cruel nor perfect. It was human. And that is why it still speaks to us. Because beneath every column and every carved face, beneath every rule about moderation and composure, was someone just like us. Adjusting before stepping outside. Hoping to belong. Hoping to be enough. And when the night fell, when the sandals were set aside, when the mirrors were dark, they too exhaled. The empire quiet. The standards asleep. The human heart still beating steadily in the dark. And if we let that steady heartbeat carry us just a little farther. Past the ruins. Past the statues. Past even the memory of empire. We begin to see the pattern more clearly. Rome was not a single moment. It was centuries of mornings and evenings. Centuries of people waking up, adjusting themselves, and stepping into a world that had expectations. No one experienced the Roman standard as an abstract idea. They experienced it as daily life. As the glance from a neighbor. As advice from a parent. As correction from a teacher. As praise for being composed. As quiet disapproval for being excessive. It was woven into routine. And that is how standards gain power. Not through grand announcements. But through repetition. The same gesture encouraged. The same posture admired. The same restraint rewarded. Day after day. Year after year. Until it feels natural. Until no one remembers when it began. But every natural thing was once chosen. And every choice can be changed. That is what the long arc of Rome reveals. There was a time before marble perfection. There was a time after it. And in between were generations who believed they were living at the center of permanence. They were not foolish for believing that. Every era feels central to itself. Every society assumes its standards are sensible, rational, perhaps even timeless. Rome was no different. Its citizens likely felt that moderation was obvious. That composure was superior. That symmetry reflected truth. And perhaps, in their context, it did. But context shifts. New pressures arise. New ideas circulate. New aesthetics appear. And slowly, the unquestioned becomes questionable. The rigid softens. The definition expands. That expansion is not chaos. It is growth. Rome feared chaos because it associated it with collapse. But not all change is collapse. Some change is evolution. Some change is widening the space in which humanity can exist. If Rome taught balance, history teaches flexibility. Balance stabilizes. Flexibility adapts. A civilization that balances without bending risks fracture. A civilization that bends without balance risks drift. The wisdom lies somewhere between the two. And perhaps that is the most generous way to understand Rome's beauty standards. Not as rigid oppression. Not as flawless philosophy. But as one attempt among many to solve a universal problem. How do we live together without falling apart? How do we create shared meaning without erasing individuality? How do we encourage dignity without suffocating authenticity? Rome answered those questions with moderation. Other cultures answer them differently. Future generations will answer them in ways we cannot yet imagine. But the questions endure. Because they belong not to Rome, but to humanity. And humanity is always negotiating itself. Always redefining worth. Always testing the limits of expectation. Always learning where structure helps. And where it harms. So now, when we think of Roman faces carved in stone, calm, rational, composed, we can see them not as commands, but as conversations. An ancient voice saying, "This is how we believed order could be seen." And our own time replying, "We see it differently now." That dialogue across centuries is proof of something hopeful. Standards do not silence humanity forever. They become part of its ongoing discussion. And discussion means movement. Movement means life. So as the final quiet settles over this long journey, let Rome remain what it truly is now. Not a judge. Not a ruler. Not a fixed ideal. But a chapter. A powerful, disciplined, ambitious chapter. In the endless human story of trying to define beauty, virtue, and belonging. The chapter closes. The marble cools. The forum empties. But the story continues. Because somewhere, in every era, someone is still standing before a mirror. Still adjusting. Still wondering. Still hoping to be seen kindly. And somewhere else, someone is learning that the mirror does not define them. That standards shift. That balance is useful. But breadth is essential. Empires rise with certainty. Humanity endures with flexibility. And long after the last statue crumbles, long after the last rule fades, the simple rhythm remains. A heart beating steadily in the dark. Uncarved. Unmeasured. Alive. And even now, after all the marble has weathered, after all the speeches have dissolved into dust, after the ideals once spoken with confidence have softened into history, there is still something quietly unfolding. Because the story was never really about Rome alone. It was about the human desire to make the invisible visible. To take something as abstract as virtue and carve it into a face. To take something as fragile as belonging and shape it into posture. To take something as uncertain as identity and stabilize it through symmetry. Rome did this with discipline. Other ages do it with different tools. But the impulse is the same. We want reassurance. We want to look at one another and recognize shared standards. Shared signals. Shared definitions of dignity. It feels safer that way. But safety purchased through rigidity always has a cost. It narrows the acceptable. It trims away the unusual. It pressures the natural into neat lines. And yet, the natural always returns. A laugh too loud. A face too expressive. A style too bold. A thought too unconventional. At first, these things stand out. Then they spread. Then they reshape the very boundaries that once contained them. That is how change moves. Not as an explosion, but as accumulation. One small deviation at a time. Rome may have believed its standards were pillars. But even pillars erode grain by grain. Not in defiance. Simply through time. And time is patient. Time does not argue with ideals. It simply outlives them. If we could stand in the Colosseum at dusk. Not during a spectacle. Not during applause. But in the quiet after. We would feel something unexpected. Not grandeur. Not authority. But openness. The structure remains. But the pressure is gone. The performance has ended. And that openness is symbolic of something larger. Standards require audience. Without constant reinforcement, they soften. Without collective agreement, they fade. Rome's beauty codes once required constant participation. Citizens performing moderation. Citizens reinforcing composure. Citizens reflecting order back to one another. But once that shared intensity dispersed, the code lost its sharp edges. It became memory. And memory is gentler than enforcement. What we inherit from Rome now is not obligation. It is perspective. We see how a society tried to equate appearance with virtue. We see how discipline can create stability. We also see how rigidity can limit expression. And seeing both is wisdom. Because the lesson is not to reject standards entirely. Nor is it to freeze ourselves inside them. It is to hold them lightly. To recognize that they serve a moment. To remember that they will pass. To allow room for breath within them. The Roman citizen may not have had that language. But they had the experience. The moment alone at night. The softened face in darkness. The private relief when no one was watching. That relief was truth. It was proof that beneath every cultural script, there is an individual pulse. And that pulse cannot be standardized. It can be guided. It can be shaped. But it cannot be fully contained. That is why Rome fascinates us still. Not because it achieved perfection. But because it tried, earnestly, systematically, ambitiously. To build a world where virtue was visible. And in watching that attempt across centuries, we better understand our own. We see our adjustments. Our performances. Our careful balances. And perhaps, with that awareness, we become gentler with ourselves. Because if even Rome, with all its structure, all its authority, all its carved certainty, could not preserve one fixed image of beauty forever, then neither must we. The sky over Rome changes color each evening. Gold to violet. Violet to indigo. The ruins glow, then fade into shadow. They do not resist the darkness. They simply exist within it. And in that quiet existence, there is no pressure. No evaluation. No standard to uphold. Only stone beneath open sky. Only wind moving freely through broken arches. Only time continuing its patient work. And somewhere, in another place, in another century, a person stands before a mirror. Not in Rome. Not in marble halls. But in their own era. Feeling the weight of expectation. Adjusting their posture. Smoothing their expression. And perhaps, just perhaps, remembering that all standards are chapters. That perfection is temporary. That breath is older than any empire. The statues remain. The ruins endure. But what carries forward? What truly lasts? Is the quiet, adaptable, uncarved human heart. And as we reach what feels like the farthest edge of this reflection, there is almost nothing left to add. Only something left to notice. Notice how the story has slowed. How the marble has faded into background. How the empire that once seemed immense has become quiet scenery behind a much older, much larger truth. Because in the end, Rome was never the center. It was a mirror. A mirror showing us what happens when a society believes it can stabilize uncertainty through visible perfection. For a while, it works. Posture aligns. Voices steady. Faces calm. Balance admired. Order feels secure. But beneath that order, life continues its restless movement. Children grow into adults who question what they inherited. New influences arrive from distant lands. Ideas blend, soften, contradict. And slowly, without fanfare, the rigid ideal becomes one possibility among many. That is not decay. That is expansion. Rome's tragedy, if it had one, was not that it valued discipline. Discipline builds strength. It was that discipline sometimes hardened into identity. An identity, when too rigid, struggles to adapt. Yet even Rome adapted more than we often admit. It absorbed cultures. It borrowed gods. It reshaped art. It evolved over centuries. The marble faces we imagine were only one moment in a long transformation. And that is important. Because no civilization is frozen. No standard remains untouched by time. The illusion of permanence is powerful. But history quietly proves otherwise. Walk among the remains of ancient Rome today, through open arches and fractured stone, and you do not feel trapped by its standards. You feel distance. Perspective. The space to breathe. What once dictated appearance now invites contemplation. The same statues that once symbolized control now symbolize endurance. Their cracks tell a story marble never intended to tell. That strength without flexibility eventually yields. But yielding is not the same as vanishing. Rome did not disappear. It transformed into influence. Into memory. Into lesson. And perhaps that is the most graceful ending any empire can hope for. Not eternal control. But lasting conversation. So if there is one final image to hold, let it be this. Not a statue. Not a forum. Not a senator's composed expression. But an ordinary person at twilight. The day's expectations behind them. The night's privacy ahead. They loosen their shoulders. They release the careful expression they carried all day. They exhale. That exhale is older than Rome. Older than marble. Older than any standard ever carved into stone. And it will outlast every standard yet to come. Empires rise seeking certainty. Humans endure through adaptability. Rome tried to sculpt virtue into visible form. Time revealed that virtue lives more fluidly than stone. And now, centuries later, the empire rests. The statues weather. The standards sleep in history books. But the rhythm continues. Breath. Heartbeat. Change. Unmeasured. Unfixed. Alive. And now. There is almost nothing left but quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness. But the quiet of completion. Rome has spoken through marble and memory. Through symmetry and discipline. Through its longing to make virtue visible. And we have followed that voice to its softest conclusion. Because when all empires are stripped of their grandeur, when all standards are separated from their urgency, what remains is astonishingly simple. A person. Standing somewhere between expectation and self. That was true in Rome. It is true now. It will be true long after every current ideal has shifted. Rome believed beauty could signal order. And for a time, it did. But beauty was never the foundation. People were. Their effort. Their insecurity. Their hope to be seen with approval rather than ridicule. Standards merely organized that hope. They gave it shape. But hope itself, the desire to belong, to be valued, to be enough, does not belong to any empire. It belongs to humanity. And humanity cannot be permanently carved. It moves. It adapts. It questions. It expands. The Roman citizen once adjusted posture beneath the gaze of the forum. Today, someone adjusts themselves beneath different gazes. The setting changes. The instinct remains. Yet here, at the very end, is the quiet reassurance Rome leaves behind. Every standard that feels immovable will one day feel historical. Every expectation that feels absolute will one day soften. Every definition of perfection will one day be studied, not obeyed. That does not make the present meaningless. It makes it human. Rome's beauty standards were not foolish. They were sincere attempts to align inner virtue with outer form. They were built from fear of chaos and love of order. From pride and anxiety intertwined. From the same mixture that shapes all civilizations. And in the end, they became something gentler than rules. They became memory. Memory does not judge. It reflects. So if you carry anything forward from this long journey through Roman ideals, let it be this. You are not marble. You are not a fixed statue beneath permanent evaluation. You are movement. You are breath. You are change unfolding in real time. Rome sought eternity in stone. Humanity achieves continuity in flexibility. The empire rests. The standards have faded into history. But the human rhythm continues. Steady. Resilient. Uncarved. Alive. And now. There is almost nothing left but quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness. But the quiet of completion. Rome has spoken through marble and memory. Through symmetry and discipline. Through its longing to make virtue visible. And we have followed that voice to its softest conclusion. Because when all empires are stripped of their grandeur, when all standards are separated from their urgency, what remains is astonishingly simple. A person. Standing somewhere between expectation and self. That was true in Rome. It is true now. It will be true long after every current ideal has shifted. Rome believed beauty could signal order. And for a time, it did. But beauty was never the foundation. People were. Their effort. Their insecurity. Their hope to be seen with approval rather than ridicule. Standards merely organized that hope. They gave it shape. But hope itself, the desire to belong, to be valued, to be enough, does not belong to any empire. It belongs to humanity. And humanity cannot be permanently carved. It moves. It adapts. It questions. It expands. The Roman citizen once adjusted posture beneath the gaze of the forum. Today, someone adjusts themselves beneath different gazes. The setting changes. The instinct remains. Yet here, at the very end, is the quiet reassurance Rome leaves behind. Every standard that feels immovable will one day feel historical. Every expectation that feels absolute will one day soften. Every definition of perfection will one day be studied, not obeyed. That does not make the present meaningless. It makes it human. Rome's beauty standards were not foolish. They were sincere attempts to align inner virtue with outer form. They were built from fear of chaos and love of order. From pride and anxiety intertwined. From the same mixture that shapes all civilizations. And in the end, they became something gentler than rules. They became memory. Memory does not judge. It reflects. So if you carry anything forward from this long journey through Roman ideals, let it be this. You are not marble. You are not a fixed statue beneath permanent evaluation. You are movement. You are breath. You are change unfolding in real time. Rome sought eternity in stone. Humanity achieves continuity in flexibility. The empire rests. The standards have faded into history. But the human rhythm continues. Steady. Resilient. Uncarved. And if we allow ourselves one final step beyond even that, we see that Rome, for all its discipline and definition, was simply participating in something far older than itself. The human instinct to create shape from uncertainty. To look at the vastness of existence and say, this is what is right. This is what is beautiful. This is what is worthy. It is an act of courage, in a way. To define is to attempt control. To standardize is to attempt stability. To sculpt is to attempt permanence. Rome was courageous in that attempt. But courage does not equal eternity. Because life is not a still sculpture. It is a river. And rivers reshape even the strongest stone. The Romans could carve faces with ideal proportions. They could teach generations to value restraint. They could elevate moderation into moral philosophy. But they could not halt the current of time. No civilization ever has. And so the story settles into something surprisingly gentle. Rome's beauty standards once felt urgent. They shaped daily behavior. They influenced power and status. They structured belonging. Now they are studied calmly. Discussed thoughtfully. Observed with distance. That distance is wisdom. Because it allows us to see both the brilliance and the limitation. The brilliance in seeking order. The limitation in mistaking order for permanence. If we stand quietly in imagination beside a weathered Roman statue, we notice something profound.